This is New Wave Jazz. This is New Wave Jazz. I'm your host, Dre Brothers. Man, we're back again with one of the most talented trumpeters, jazz producers, just all around music artists of that I've came across since being a program director here at WSSB. None other than Jeremy Pelt. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Dre, for having me.
Ain't no problem, man. On behalf of myself and WSSB, we just want to say thank you for joining us and allowing us to have spend a little moment of your time, man. So, without further ado, Jeremy Pelt, a man of purpose, a heralded trumpeter, producer, and educator. Let's talk about your beginnings and what brought you to playing the trumpet.
Well, I started in school in a time where instruments were uh, available in abundance. That was in the 80s. Uh, I think I was in fourth grade when I started the trumpet. And initially, I was into classical music a lot,
Hmm.
very much into classical music, and didn't really discover jazz in a way that uh, took over my body until high school, which would have been 91.
Hmm.
And when I got into school, in high school, that was the year that Miles Davis died. And
Oh, wow.
so one of the upperclassmen comes in and says we should play So What in honor of Miles, which I'd never heard of.
Hmm.
And we played the chart. And I noticed that some of the students were playing, but I couldn't follow where they were on my chart. And so after the song, I asked the teacher, well, where were they? Because I was lost. And he said, well, they were improvising. What's that? Oh, okay. They were, composing a solo on the spot.
Hmm.
Um, and I was fascinated by that. And so I went to my local record store and I found a CD, a tape
Mhm.
from Miles Davis, which didn't, it what, interestingly enough, it wasn't Kind of Blue that I found. It was Miles live at Carnegie Hall. And when I heard that, I was, it, it just took over me right then and there.
And it just carried on all the way up until now.
Absolutely.
Wow. You're the first artist that I've had on here who kind of attributed, their playing to Miles Davis. We hint people, a lot of artists hint at it, but they don't have a story behind, Miles Davis. I'm a big fan of Miles Davis. My dad got me a record of Sketches of Spain. That was my first time ever hearing anything Miles Davis. I didn't know anything about him, like his biography or anything, but his playing was just so renowned and so unique for the genre. I just really think that I can hear that in your music as well, and especially throughout your discography. But let's talk about your newest album, man. Oxford defines the word griot as a member of a class of traveling poets, musicians, and storytellers who maintain a tradition of oral history in parts of West Africa. Now, griot, this is important. That's the name of your album. Talk about your work ethic, towards making a deliberate like statement for this album. I think listening is kind of like almost like a book, we'll get to that later, but tell us about the story you are telling here and the importance of knowing the history behind the music.
Well, that's a good question. You know, there through the trajectory of any artist's career, there's going to be um, albums that they put out which um, are fun things to do,
Mm.
and I don't want to make light of any of my previous albums, but what I mean to say is that there are albums that are a set of tunes that you're going to play and put on an album for
Mhm.
consumption, um, and then there are things that represent a more important kind of uh, period in your life, in one's life. And so griot is something of is really, it's not even for me necessarily a strong musical record
Right.
as much as it underscores the stories of the interviews
Right.
you see
Mhm.
that are included on the record. So for me, the takeaway is the stories, and the music is, I mean, it's like going to a movie, you know,
Right.
because and these are the terms that I think about because I was a film scoring major in college,
Oh wow.
so you know when I would go, even when you go to movie, when anybody goes to a movie, you're going to see whatever is happening on the screen. You're going to see your
Right.
favorite actor, Denzel, whoever, and see them on the screen acting in the screenplay.
Right.
And there's always music that accompanies that. And a real good score is something that doesn't get in the way of the story, but enhances the story. It makes you feel a certain type of way. And so that's what this record really kind of represents to me. It's not necessarily something that um is a standalone just for the music, but it's really about um getting you, the listener, to feel the emotion of the words that are spoken.
That is very like relevant and prevalent throughout this album. I think it's a very unique type of jazz album. Because when you first listen to it and you're going through it and you're like, oh, I'm expecting something like the Art of Intimacy a little bit. I'm expecting something, along that line. And when I listened to this one, this was very more so kind of like a documentary in a sense of jazz.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And I think that
Yeah.
was just incredible. Speaking of, the stories within this project, let's take a look at Underdog. You talked to the late Larry Willis. Excuse me. Um, we can take a listen to that, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that track. Okay. So without further ado, in new wave jazz fashion, this is Underdog by none other than Jeremy Pelt from his latest album, Griot. This is important.
What does it mean to be a black jazz musician in the United States?
What does it mean to be a black jazz musician in the United States? You have to make a real commitment to this music. Okay, you got to want this for yourself in order to survive it all. And you and I've done it. Okay, there's a certain pride that I take in doing what I do, knowing that the music that I play economically represents less than 2% of the music that is played that makes money here in the United States. Okay, but I don't mind being an underdog. Okay, because being an underdog gives me a reason to fight.
You just heard Larry Willis transitioning to Jeremy Pelt's a track entitled Underdog. Jeremy Pelt, can you talk about this track and talk about, what posed this type of this type of reaction, this type of track for this album?
Well, this was ongoing part of the interview process that I was doing for the book,
Mhm.
and I had met up with Larry Willis. It was a week that we were actually playing at a club in New York called Smoke, and he agreed to do the interview. And so we met up in the Bronx at a diner, and one of the things that I always dug about talking to Larry and so many of the people that I interviewed was that there was always something, some kind of tidbit in what they were saying, which the whole interview was prolific and profound in itself, but then there's that one soundbite that jumps at you.
Right.
And so when he's answering the question that I asked him, which you played,
Mhm.
and he says something, he says, look, being an underdog, I don't mind being an underdog. It gives me a reason to fight. That resonated
Mhm.
to my core.
Yeah.
And so I heard that song,
Mhm.
after I went ahead and transcribed the interview and everything. Then I really heard that kind of melody come out, and I said, okay, this should be underdog.
Oh wow, yeah, and it's very like it meshes very well, Jeremy. You talked about your book. I have this question as far as was the album like a baby from the book, or or how, tell me about that. Tell me about like the steps
Hmm.
to creating the whole world of Griot.
Well, so I had it in my head for a long time that I was going to write a book that
Mhm.
was similar in just about every way to Art Taylor's Notes and Tones.
Okay.
And so that was the first thing. It was
Mhm.
always going to be about a book. Then I maybe a few months later, after I had the thought of doing that, decided, I'm gonna, write music that's, based off of these interviews. That came about. I still have the notes because a lot of times I jot notes on my phone and I save them in my, and I still have that outline of what I wanted to do. And that was in July of 2019. So I started with the book in October of 2018. I started my first person that I interviewed was Paul West, who's also the first on the record and
Mhm.
also the first entrant in the book. And and then in July I said, you know what, I'm going to write some music to this too. And so that was always the plan. So the book came first.
Okay, that's very interesting. Let's talk about the book. The book is entitled Griot: Examining the Lives of Jazz's Great Storytellers. So be sure to check that out. Can you let them know, where they can find it?
Absolutely. You can go to my website. Uh, First of all, I should say that it's not available any other place, not on Amazon or anything. You got to go to my website,
Right.
which is jeremypelt.net. And there's a link that'll take you to my online store. And you can order the book in hardcover or paperback, or you could order the CD itself and a few other CDs of mine as well. You could also order some sheet music of certain songs. So I mean, it's
It's
there's a lot of stuff on the store, but yeah, certainly the book is available there.
okay. Yeah, I think that any jazz lover or anybody who admires the music and the artist behind the music, I find this book very, very important to have. Um, Tell me about that process still, usually like you said, you're the artist, so how was it like flipping the role taking in a sense taking this seat that I'm in
Mhm.
and doing that with other pioneers of jazz like yourself.
You know, just now I had the thought that, first of all, to answer your question, it was the process was painless and it was fun
Okay.
because essentially I'm just, it was a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
especially back then. It's funny to talk about back then, but I mean, as we've been locked down for a year and a half now,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost it takes a lot for you to remember how things were before we were not allowed to see each other. But I mentioned that because I mean I was going to cats' houses
Mm-hmm.
and I was sitting in the living room and we would just have this conversation and I asked them a bunch of questions. And the thought that I was just having right now is because back years ago, I mean I used to know people like Freddie Hubbard
Mm-hmm.
and all my idols,
Yeah.
some that I played with um, and recorded with, and there was something, I was inquisitive, but I think at that point I wasn't overbearing with questions, and a lot of that is because you assume that you're going to see somebody the
Mm-hmm.
next day. You know what I mean? I'll ask them later. I'll ask
Right.
them later. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Until that doesn't exist anymore. So I mean, as close as somebody like Freddie Hubbard and I were,
Mm.
we didn't talk about like real specific things. You
Yeah.
know, that now I listen to records and I'll be like, I wonder what he was playing there, or and these are easily questions that I could have asked
Right.
when he was still alive. So, as it relates to the book, this is it was a fun and it still remains a fun process because I'm still interviewing people. Some people that I've known for quite a long time, others that I'm acquainted with, but not on a real personal level. So it gives me the chance, and especially with the success of the first volume, this having it be released and established, there also creates a kind of a strong basis for me to be asking all these questions and getting to know people on a certain level, so it's a fun process, really.
And I could tell that from just from like transitioning back to the album, I could tell that especially when you were talking with JD Allen,
Hmm.
Don't Dog the Source. And I honestly, man, can relate to that because that's kind of like what new wave jazz is. I know you hit me with the fly ball when I called you and you was like, hey, what is the purpose, And that was a great question that resonated with me because it was like, I had to be clear to let not only you but the listeners understand what is the point of new wave jazz. And like your conversation, well, from that snippet of with JD Allen, you guys talk about the importance of, hey, really, you need to respect. It's kind of like a respectful thing, you need to respect the groundwork, the foundation, because to me, without jazz, I think Robert Glasper said this, jazz is the mother of hip hop. Jazz is the mother of these things that is popular now, So let's take a listen to that Don't Dog the Source from his recent album, Griot. This is important. This is new wave jazz.
Because I want to go on record saying this. It's
Hmm.
like, it's not about if I dig it or not.
Hmm.
I'm down with cats doing what they want to do. Just don't dog the source.
Uh-huh.
Don't say you hate your nose and you hate your lips and you hate your hair. Don't do that. It's like,
Hmm.
if you're gonna do what you're gonna do, let your music speak. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Let the music talk. And I'm not saying don't be vocal about it, but don't get into a situation where you're on the other side that doesn't listen to what we do,
Hmm.
or the root music, and you say, "Oh, I hate that," and then when you come around us, you fluffing the hip hop side.
Right.
It's like, don't do that. Just,
Right.
why can't it be like how, well, how people I admire how they spoke about it. It was like, hey, I listen to this, I listen to that.
Yeah.
If it's good music, if it's great music, it's great music. If it's not, it's not. And that's my only problem with that. You know, with them, I say them, but young brothers doing what they're doing. Just don't hate yourself.
This is New Wave Jazz, and we just heard Don't Dog the Source along with the excerpt with Jeremy Pelt talking with JD Allen. Jeremy, can you talk about this track as well and talk about, what, what also, fueled this track to be created?
JD played in my group. First of all, I mean, let me. I met JD back in maybe '96 when he was playing with Betty Carter, and I was in college. And then shortly thereafter, I moved to New York, and we had occasion to play in a few different configurations. And when I decided to form my what I would describe as my first important quintet, that group featured JD, and we logged a lot of time, a lot of years on the road, going abroad, and we used to have, the thing is, the conversation, the interview for the book is one, withstanding, we used to have these kind of conversations all the time.
Mhm.
I mean, if I were the type of person that recorded everything, I mean, we had these kind of conversations and debates and everything all the time on the road. We'd sit next to each other, across the aisle from each other on the airplane, and just be talking and going back and forth. So he is always someone that's fun to really bounce ideas off of and really talk to. And so that conversation is just an example of that. Um, the song itself was just uh, something that I felt. I mean, all the songs that I've recorded on the record is something that I really felt reflected the tone of the conversation.
Mhm.
Is basically as succinct as I could put it.
Okay. Yeah, because like I said, like you hear that, it's like it's straightforward, it's right there. It flows, it meshes very well, and it makes you, and it not only the listener, for me, it put me in that room with you guys. Like, okay. And it made me think about the conversation I had with my peers, hey man, to me, I'm like, it wouldn't be any De La Soul or those a Tribe Called Quest if it wasn't for Herbie Hancock, and it wasn't for, we wouldn't even have, I would even say Kendrick Lamar's and stuff like that. Musically, I would say, from if there wasn't any jazz. So I think that bringing that conversation to light more and introducing like people of my generation, like the younger generation who's trying to understand jazz and trying to really know it. I think it's very important. And I think, like if it aligns with the title, it's a very important conversation that needs to be had and highlighted. So actually, man, I appreciate you putting that in this album. Um, JD, man. Oh, Jeremy, I'm thinking about JD. Jeremy, excuse me. You've worked with so many different artists, man. From Ralph Peterson, Wayne Shorter, JD Allen, Chin Chin Lu. I mentioned Chin Chin Lu. I talked to her a few, like about a month ago. She's a very a talented musician, and so many others. You were standout at Black Art Jazz Collective. Talk about some of your experience with some of those artists and what you have learned, from any other griots that you have worked with.
Well, I mean, to an extent, I'll talk about Ralph Peterson,
Okay.
um, because Ralph was somebody. Number one, because he, passed away not too long ago,
Mm,
but also, he was somebody that had quite an impact on, my essentially my hustle.
mm,
What I really observed and learned from my time with him, and not only him, but I could name a handful of people. Ralph is definitely at the top of the list. Also, Lonnie Plaxico. These were artists and are artists that were the cream of the crop on their instruments that decided, okay, I'm going to try to have this solo career and get my music out there and have a band
Right.
in an industry in a business that wasn't really trying to help that cause,
Mm,
because in this industry it's not so much about the talent of the artist, the fortitude of the artist. It's really about what somebody sitting in an office that has no music wants.
mm,
No, when I say no music, it's not a musician rather.
right.
So it's left up to that one person to put
Mm,
somebody out there, and that's what they do. And some people make good on that promise,
mm,
and that's not just jazz. That's through the whole all genres.
mm,
And some people are big failures. But it is what it is. But now when we talk about jazz, and these artists that I mentioned, like Ralph and Lonnie, these are people again that are big presence, that highly respected,
mm,
and yet can't get arrested as a solo artist. And I saw, through being in both of their bands, especially at the time that I just had moved to New York, I really saw their hustle
mm,
to get what they wanted to do done
mm,
without the help of label support and tour support and all those things that make things just a bit easier, you know.
yeah.
Um, and so that really inspired me. That really taught me, because if I'm being honest, I mean, I'm always going to be very happy for the accolades and the reviews and the write-ups and the stories and whatnot that I've gotten over the 23 years that I've been here. And I'll be very honest and blunt and tell you that I deserve every one of them.
Yeah.
And I could also say that from then to now has always been an uphill battle, because I didn't receive the same kind of push as the people that were generations before me. So you're talking about Roy and
Mm,
Nicholas and those kind of cats,
right.
and then the generation that's after me, that's that has that push from the label,
Yeah.
and just from just the write-ups that they get. And this is no ill will on any of them,
Right. Right.
because they deserve to be where they're. But what I'm saying is, through having seen how Ralph and Lonnie and and these different cats who had a name and had a presence
Right.
had to really work and be tireless about taking and controlling their own narrative and handling their own career, that in turn inspired me to
Right.
do the same thing. Also, I could also say that my mother was a big influence as far as that's concerned as well. She's a
Right.
griot as well. It's not just a man's game, right?
Right.
That she was probably the ultimate griot as far as that's concerned, because she was always a hustler and is still always a hustler. So I mean, I grew up with her saying, "Always be your own boss." You
Mm,
know what I mean?
right.
So I mean, that's kind of everything that fed into the way that I think now. But especially in terms of music and
Mm,
getting things happening, it's never going to be on easy street. So I'm always prepared to work, and that's the thing that I learned the most from Ralph Peterson. Let's say.
always prepared to work. And I think like you said, like your work and your music and everything that you're doing shows that. Uh just knowing that I grabbed this interview, I knew I had to have this. I knew just from musically that it was a level of respect that I have to come with. You know what I'm saying? I have to come to you with just from the foundations that you lay for yourself and for the genre of jazz and other inspiring jazz musicians. You kind of you spoke a bit about working hard and like just being tireless. And you spoke earlier about being on lockdown. Talk about, how did you react to that? And it's hard, and it's all like you said, it's hard, when you're your own artist, you're telling your own narrative, and then you have to deal with, um, I guess, God's way of putting things back in control in a sense. So how did you, react? How did you react musically, and how did that affect you musically, if it did or not?
How did the lockdown affect me
Yeah,
musically?
yeah, the lockdown, if it did.
Well, I mean, I would venture to say that at least for the first month and a half, I was just in limbo. A lot of
Mm,
people, because
yeah.
that was a time, and still is, but more so last year, a time of significant change
Mm,
that nobody expected, and surely nobody wanted.
right.
And so it put you in a different situation of how you are going to present your art.
Mm,
It When people say we're going to go back to normal in the music business, I mean, you're always going to have people that say, "Oh, I don't want to go back to the way it used to be," in this, and it is not.
right.
That's good. So they win if you don't want it to. It's not going to be the way it used to be. But I think the strong survive,
Right.
and the quicker you learn how to adapt, which I'm not going to sit over here and paint the picture that said, "Well, I knew how to adapt immediately," because I didn't.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? I mean, I was, prior to COVID, yeah, I had the social media presence,
Right.
but jazz, first of all, especially in jazz, when you're talking about being on the road, it's one of the things that I'm most proud of in my own career that I don't see a lot of younger people understanding quite yet, is that this is a people
Right.
oriented business,
Yes.
relationships. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's not, for the moment, everything is done on Zoom. We're talking on Zoom, but
Right.
for the moment, and it's a big ass moment. Excuse
Right.
my language.
You're good.
It's a year and a half, but
Hmm.
it's a big moment.
Right.
But at the end of the day, when we talk about things that are going to be going back to normal, we're going to go back to a situation, a point where we still have to cultivate relationships
Yeah.
with people, and they want to be able to feel you. And I'm talking about business relationships now.
Hmm.
They want to be able to feel the warmth of the artist,
Right.
and vice versa. That's very important to this music. So I say all that to say that when before that, before COVID, I was, of course, traveling like I always did, having relationships with the clubs and promoters like I always did, and that I continue to cultivate,
Right.
you know, year in, year out. And then all of a sudden, the paradigm changed because now we're not traveling.
Right.
So now, whereas I had, my little, Instagram page and Facebook, and I could proudly not be as available on either of those platforms. I never used Twitter. I have a Twitter account. Now I use it all the time because I got something to sell and I can't
Yeah.
go anywhere.
Right.
So now you see how important a device social media is.
Yes. Right.
And because and before that, I was blissfully just not trying to deal with all that because I was dealing with the real world. I'm like, I ain't got time to be
On the
doing
internet. Yeah.
because I used to see people posting all the time and everything be a selfie, and then they trying to do that. I'm like, man,
Man.
listen,
Yeah.
I'm out here doing it, and now
Right.
we all in the same boat. So now
Yeah.
I'm selfieing and I'm posting every day and doing all the types of things just to remain relevant, because now that is where we are right now.
Right.
So, when you talk about, how's the music affected by that? Yeah, I mean, there was a time, about a month and a half into this where I wasn't producing anything. I wasn't thinking about anything musically because I was scared.
Yeah, that's true. I think at a point
Scared of the
everybody was
future.
scared. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and then once, probably the midsummer started,
Mm-hmm.
then I started to kind of get a handle on myself. You got to shake yourself
Right.
and be like, "Hey, listen, Pelt, man, what are you doing?"
Right.
And then you start to say, okay, let me energize myself. And that's what happened.
Hmm. You said some very important things here. What I want to do, I want to highlight another track from your album, man. We're back to Griot. This is important. Uh, let's take a listen to Relevance. I think that's one for me. That's a huge one that resonated for me, just musically. That one kind of got me through a few things. But we'll let the listeners check that out. Without further ado, in new wave jazz fashion, this is Relevance by none other than Jeremy Pelt from his latest album, Griot. This is important. This is New Wave Jazz. We just heard Relevance by none other than Jeremy Pelt. We're talking about his book, his album, his documentary style of presenting his artwork of jazz. Jeremy, can you tell us about that track, Relevance?
Yeah, that was something that was inspired by the meeting and the interview that I had with trumpeter Ambrose Akinmusire.
Mm-hmm.
And, I asked him about the relevance of knowing the history of the music, um, as it is for young people. The relevance of young people, is it relevant to what they're doing now,
Mm-hmm.
the younger generations? And you obviously heard his answer, and
Yeah.
so that was kind of the track itself has this kind of hurried type of feel to it,
Right.
and I think in retrospect, it probably represents, this kind of youthful kind of exuberance of
Mm-hmm.
wanting to get to the next level, you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
So,
And that's all that's well, that's what I've learned, it's like after what we're going through now. Everything is we're so worried about what's coming next or what's the next thing we can get on. I know you probably heard of NFTs, stuff like that, like cryptocurrency. It's always we're worried about the next thing. So
yeah.
you kind of make me pose this question, and it makes me wonder, how do you feel or what are you doing to present, this type of music to the younger generation? Or how do what do you think would, you know, transfer smoothly and, easily to comprehend for that, for the next generation or the generation behind, talk about that.
Well, it's interesting. I would disagree with you in one use of your phrase,
Right.
because I don't think that the music itself is hard to comprehend.
Okay.
Sonically, I don't see it. I too was young. I'm still young, but I mean, I too was, in teenage years in the 20s, and I got it.
Right.
And it just, it's knowledge, like everything, just deepens,
Mhm.
and that turns into wisdom.
Mhm.
You see, so the older you get and the more versed you get, and you keep learning things. It could be
Right.
this. You could learn about how to cook a pan of eggs,
Mhm.
scrambled eggs. And you might learn one way and they're scrambled. Okay, now they're scrambled. Then you might see, somebody else and how they cook scrambled eggs, and you might, oh, well, these are pretty good. And then you start incorporating that method, and then it goes on and on and on.
Mhm.
So this music is not really hard to understand.
Mhm.
Um, I think that, and it's funny because I just had a big forum like conversation not a few days ago with a bunch of grandmaster jazz musicians.
Mhm.
And when we talk about getting the youth interested, it has to come from your aesthetic doesn't necessarily have to change in a wild type of way. I mean, there's certain people that have the young people's ear, right? So you have your Robert Glaspers and Terrace Martins and
Right.
and those artists. They're doing a great job.
Mhm.
And especially their aesthetic and how they approach it resonates with the audience of today,
Right.
the young audience of today. I think that the young audience of today can still get with the acoustic setting and what's happening, but there also has to be applicability, um, coming from the older established artists that are willing to incorporate ideas from the younger audience.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Right.
A long time ago, I was at church, And this sermon really stuck out to me, and I can't remember. I'm only going to be able to maybe approximate how the pastor put it, but it summarily was essentially talking about the fact that a lot of times us as older people, kind of, look down on the younger people and represent ourselves as always the guiding light of help, and we're there, which is there's truth to that, but the way that he put it was that there's also time for us, the older people, to bend down to the younger people and also receive help as well and bring yourself to that. And
Right.
so, in as much as wisdom counts for a lot, and you only get that through experience, and
Right.
experience doesn't necessarily mean, um, advancing years, but that certainly comes with the territory. uh, there also has to be an element of understanding what is happening currently and seeing how that could affect your music. You see what I mean? So when
Right.
you think about Miles Davis, you know, he decided, especially after his much younger sidemen said, "All right, I'm gonna go ahead and do some funk."
Right.
Or not even much younger, because I mean, Cannonball Adderley was only 2 years younger than Miles, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
he said he was like the first person to really get into the electronics and doing all those records, you know. And then Herbie goes and he's doing his thing. So everybody around him is already starting to change, and he's not, and he's Miles Davis. So his ego was like, "I'm Miles, and you worked for me, and now you getting more." No, that ain't gonna happen. So
Right.
he had to figure out how to really incorporate what was going on currently so that he could still be on top.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But do it in an honest way, to where it wasn't, because I mean, there are those that will go ahead and just do an about face and then try to just be something that they're not. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Mouse
All of
was
a sudden,
still
be
Mouse.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, R&B. Okay, yeah. Now all of a sudden I'm gonna be, you know, jazzy. That's not gonna cut it. You know what I mean?
Right.
You have to figure out a way that to incorporate that into what you're doing, and to make it something that's honest,
Mhm.
and learn from a younger crowd that still wants to see themselves within the trajectory of the music.
You mentioned being honest from just being honest with everything that you do with the music.
Mhm.
Speaking of this album, and I'm sure your book is very transparent, and honest, as far as the conversations being held. Um, I want to talk about the Harold Mayburn track, Solidarity.
Mhm.
Well, I want to say it's his track, but you guys had a conversation. Uh, I want to listen. I want the listeners to take a listen to that, and we'll chop it up about that one. Without further ado, this is New Wave Jazz. Here's Solidarity by none other than Jeremy Pelt.
I mean, how was the solidarity amongst the brothers, on the
Great.
scene back then?
So little backstabbing you didn't even notice it. Now, like I said, these cats were strung out. They were still loved and respected each other.
Yeah. Well, that's
Backstabbing was minute.
yeah.
Brothers got along, supported each other.
Mm-hmm.
AT, I said, "Woo, AT, man, you sure sound great." He said, "Man, I'm playing Philly Joe shit."
Uh-huh.
His exact words.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carr, what you listen to? Listen to Philly Joe. Ron, Ron Carr, what you listen? I'm still going to listen to PC.
Yeah, yeah.
So you see, it was a healthy scene.
Right.
This is new wave jazz. You just heard "Solidarity" and an excerpt from Harold Mabern. Jeremy, can you talk about this transition, about this track "Solidarity" for us?
Yeah, so again, this was another interview that I had with Harold Mabern, who's no longer with us.
Hmm.
And it, the thing about Harold was, he reminded me of my grandfather the most out of anybody. Whereas, and what I mean by that is that summer after summer, I used to sit on the couch next to my grandfather and hear him tell a lot of the same stories.
Mm.
And every once in a while, there would be something new added to it, but it was still a lot of the same stories that
Mm.
and I didn't have a problem with that at all because sometimes you needed to hear things over and over again, right?
Right.
Um, Harold was somebody that, like the snippet that's on the record, that wasn't the first time I heard it. It wasn't something that was like, oh, really? I asked the question because I wanted to have it on record,
Right.
for the book. But the 20 years that I knew Harold and and played with him, uh, he was always the person that would be on the mic talking to the whole audience about
Mm.
these very same things. I mean, so he was very generous with his knowledge. And so in that snippet, he's talking about how everybody had each other's back. And what my takeaway from it was that, and you don't see it as often in today's times, which is why I wanted to make a big deal, quote unquote, a big deal out of it, is because I think even just in the culture outside of jazz,
Mhm.
there's very little acknowledgement to uh I'll put it like this. It takes death for people to really acknowledge, and appreciate people's life,
That's true.
you
Yeah.
know,
Hmm.
and that's a sad thing, especially in jazz, and you saw it. I mean, look, I saw it with Roy.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, we all appreciated Roy. I mean, Roy was like a matinee idol to me when I was in high school. So I mean, Roy was just like everything, and me and Roy always had a great relationship. When I became professional, and we didn't talk as much. We both busy, whatnot, but he was always somebody that I held in the highest regard.
Right.
And but you would start to see it on the scene. Everybody's coming out of the woodwork now. Oh, Roy was this and Roy was that, but you had nothing to say when he was here trying
When
to
it was
tell.
important. Yeah.
You know,
Hmm.
you didn't really regard him um, with that kind of respect. I mean, I feel like there's a respect that's brought to people that are still like Pharoah Sanders and Ron
Hmm.
Carter, or
Right.
Benny Gold. Once you're an octogenarian or in your 90s or something like that, then of course people are going to be like, oh, Mr. Carter, and Miss,
Right.
and of course, and they should be. I'm not. That's not. But what I'm saying is what Harold's sentiment kind of meant to me was that people were a lot more willing back then to
Hmm.
put aside their egos and tell you what it was that got them to what they had just played. So when he says, I used to talk to Art Taylor, and Art Taylor says, "Oh man, I ain't," he said, "Oh man, Art Taylor, you sound great." He said, "Oh man, I'm just playing, Phil Joe."
Right.
That lets you know that you have that lineage right there. And
Mm.
he doesn't say that like, I'm nothing.
Right.
He's saying that there's a lineage, and there's an influence that presides over my playing.
Mm.
And so I thought that was very important for the scene.
Yeah.
That was always something that was he told me also about Lee Morgan. That'll be in another volume because he's not in
Okay.
the first volume. But he told me about how Lee Morgan was somebody that always gave it up to cats. You come back, he would be out of town, and he might hear somebody in another city who nobody's heard of, and he would come back to New York and be like, man, there's this trumpet player in, such and such. And
Mhm.
that, you know,
That's the
that was the
love,
kind of
yeah.
cat he was. That was also the kind of cat Roy was.
Hmm.
I know because Justin Robbins told me. He was like, man, when you first moved on the scene, man, Roy came back and told us, he said, man, there's this new cat in town, Jeremy Pelt, and that's how,
Hmm.
that's how
Yeah.
things happen, man.
Right.
Because here's the other thing is this: jazz no longer is the popular music.
Right.
I don't know who needs to hear this, but I mean, it's no longer the popular music,
Mm.
not like the 40s and the 50s.
Yeah.
So when we talk about what is being consumed by the public and what's being bought by the public, it's always, as in my lifetime,
Mhm.
represented, a very small percentage. So the least that we could do as artists and musicians is to be a mouthpiece, not only for our own music, but for other people's music that we appreciate,
Yeah.
so
That's
that we
true.
can cast the light so that everything grows. But if you're just, hiding it in there,
Right.
then it's always just going to be this a small representation of what it could be
Hmm.
or what it should be.
Man, Jeremy Pelt, man, this conversation is very, very much needed. I want to thank you for your time, man, and the conversations. I really think this interview was the most informational and most relative conversation towards the respect and the importance of jazz and where it's been, what it is now, and where it could, where it could grow and go. Like you said, it put things for me as a jazz listener in another perspective because I didn't see it that way really until kind of you said you like, hey, you got to show that love and tell other people about what's happening or what you're hearing or what you heard, like, oh, this cat is good, and that's what we try to do here. That's what I try to expose here at New Wave Jazz, man. And I really appreciate your words and your time. Let our listeners know, what we can look out for. Uh, Again, where they can follow you, where they can get the book and your music.
Well, you can keep looking out for that book.
I know.
That's really what you keep looking out for.
All
And
right.
you can find the
Keep
book.
on.
You can find the book at my website, jeremypelt.net. Again, that's the only place that you'll find it. Don't go looking on on Amazon and every place yet. There
Okay.
will be more volumes. So
Hmm.
that is one thing that you could actually look out for. I plan to release the volume two
Hmm.
um next February, I believe. I'll do that. There'll be new music. I'm starting to work on new music right now. So I've also been producing
Okay.
new artists that'll be coming out with some CDs this year.
Okay.
Michael Stevenson is one. Bruce Harris. Michael Stevenson is a saxophone player and a great vocalist, young cat. And that's going to come out on Cellar Live
Okay.
record label. Same thing with Bruce Harris. He's a great trumpeter rather, and his record will be coming out on Cellar Live. And I've also produced Anthony Wanzi, who's really no stranger to the music. He's been out here longer than I have.
Mhm.
Great pianist, and his record will be coming out on Cellar Live. Also, young saxophonist named Nicole Glover. Her CD will
Mhm.
be coming out on Savant Records later on this year. So I mean, lots of great artists that are going to be coming out with material.
Oh wow, man, you got your hand in a lot, Jeremy, man. I must
Thank
say,
you. Yeah.
I must say, again, man, thank you so much for spending time with us here at New Wave Jazz and right here on WSSB 90.3 South Carolina's jazz station. We appreciate you. Stay safe. Thank you for your time. This is New Wave Jazz.